But at the same time, perhaps despite or perhaps because of these sort of positive other effects, this is also a period of really extreme xenophobia and nativism. And it's also a period where in the 1920s, there's going to be a really dramatic change to immigration policy. That a series of quota acts, first in 1921 and then 1924, are going to essentially close the American border to immigration, especially from Europe. This is also a period that's sort of really important and interesting in terms of health and public health. So infectious diseases were absolutely major killers in cities during this period. And yet, if you look over sort of the slightly longer run, as we go from the late 19th century to the early 20th century to the mid 20th century, this is also the period where cities, although they start very dangerous and deadly, they become less and less so. The urban mortality penalty eventually disappears, and it's no longer a huge risk to your life to live in a city. So obviously there's a lot of certain interesting things running around in terms of health and immigration that sort of coincide during this period that makes it a natural place for us to look at this nexus of immigration and mortality. And so I'll give you the results now, and then we'll sort of spend the rest of the talk unpacking them as we go. So what we find is in the early 20th century, these immigration restrictions, these sort of quota acts that stopped immigrants from showing up in the US, that they did in fact reduce urban mortality. We show that the cities where there's sort of more missing immigrants, places that would have expected to receive a lot more immigrants, had the quota laws not sort of closed the border, that they have really sharp declines in death from infectious diseases. And now, why is this the case? Oh, were the nativists right? Were the immigrants showing up with like death and disease on their shirts? And that's not at all the case. So really, we sort of think of this as the nativists kind of causing the problems that they then hated later. The immigrants were sort of enduring incredibly brutal living conditions. They're living in, I have a picture of a New York City tenement behind me, which I guess from the vantage point of 100 years later looks kind of cute to live in. But at the time, these are incredibly crowded, not very well served by public health, not very well served by, anything else, government in the city. Immigrants are living in sort of pretty bad conditions in American cities, and it's these conditions that sort of lead rise to the sort of high levels of mortality that we're going to observe. And then, in fact, we see the mortality declines are the biggest in the places where immigrants had previously resided in these sort of worst conditions, right? So you can imagine if you stop people from coming in, the overcrowded tenements get a little less crowded, and from a public health perspective, that's really good. Obviously, there's a lot of other negative consequences, but that's really what's sort of driving the effects we're going to find. It's not so much that the people were bringing death and disease as a lot of those cartoons might have imagined, but instead the conditions they were forced to live in were sort of brewing the death and disease.